Hello and welcome to Talking Finance. I'm Alan Kohler, and this week on the show, well, we're looking into the Delta variant, which is causing havoc in New South Wales at the moment, and of course in the UK and everywhere in the world of COVID. So to look at the impact of all this on the economy, we're talking to Saul Eslake, who's an independent economist, former chief economist for ANZ. Here's Saul Eslake, who's an independent economist who lives in Tasmania, but his business is called Corinna Advisory. Saul, interesting point in your latest chart pack saying that if employment continued to grow at half the pace so far this year, unemployment would be down to 3.25% by June next year. That's, I think that's very interesting. Explain it to us.
Prior to the onset of COVID, over the 10 years to March 2020, the civilian working age population was growing by an average of about 26,000 a month. That meant that you needed to create at least 16,500 new jobs a month on average in order to keep the unemployment rate constant. If you did better than that, the unemployment rate would fall. If you did worse than that, all else being equal, the unemployment rate would go up. The unemployment rate fluctuated from month to month and quarter to quarter over this period, but on average, 16,500 new jobs a month was more or less precisely what we got over the decade to March 2020, which is why the unemployment rate was 5.25% at the beginning of that decade and 5.25% at the end of it. Since the onset of the pandemic, the working age population has grown at an average monthly rate of less than 5,000, which has meant that anything more than 3,000 new jobs a month during that period, on average, would see the unemployment rate fall. In the current quarter, the June quarter, the working age population's grown by just under 10,000 a month, which means you've only needed to create an average of 6,000 new jobs a month in order to get the unemployment rate down. What I'm suggesting is that if employment grew over the 13 months between now and June 2022, when the budget assumed that the borders would again reopen, at the rate it has done since January this year, which is over 50,000 a month, the unemployment rate would be down to less than 1% by the middle of next year. I think that's a clearly unsustainable pace of job creation. But if we managed half of it, say 26,000 a month, then the unemployment rate would be down to about 3.5% by June of next year. Or even if we just created 12,000 new jobs a month on average, which I think we can probably easily do, the unemployment rate would be down to 4.5% by June next year, which is roughly where the Reserve Bank and the Treasury have indicated they believe the full employment rate of unemployment, the rate of unemployment that signals a labour market that's sufficiently tight to generate the sort of wage inflation that the Reserve Bank thinks would be required to push the underlying rate of consumer price inflation sustainably back into the 2 to 3% target band. We could easily be there by this time next year.
Would you say that 12,000 a month is a lock?
Nothing's guaranteed, Alan, in forecasting, but it seems to me that that's a fairly easily attainable target. And people might say, and they have, what about the demand that migrants, foreign students and tourists would have created and the jobs that would have flowed from that if they'd been allowed into the country? And it's certainly true that we're missing that. On the other hand, however, and this is the other important but overlooked aspect of the closure of our borders, Australians would have spent, based on what they've actually done in previous years, something like $55 billion overseas in the last 12 months if they'd been allowed out of the country, which, of course, unless they're sports people or politicians, they're not. And that $55 billion is money that Australians still have because their incomes have held up unusually well over the past recession. And what's clear from looking at the retail sales figures, at the motor vehicle sales figures, and at the figures for approvals of renovations by local governments, is that Australians have been spending most of that $55 billion they would have preferred to spend overseas if they'd been allowed to, in their homes, on electrical and electronic equipment, furniture, floor coverings, curtains and the like, on themselves, clothing, pharmaceuticals, booze, on cars, and on renovating and improving their homes and their surroundings. This is why building firms are doing so well. It's why JB Hi-Fi and Harvey Norman are doing so well, because they're the beneficiaries of spending that, if we were still a free country, would have been undertaken overseas.
Saul, dare I say it, possibly more useful spending of money than wandering around Rome.
Well, if we are a free country, it's not up to the government to decide whether that's useful spending or not. But the point is...
I must say, I wonder whether that $55 billion is part of the reason, if not the main reason, that the government has stopped us travelling, which is a very unusual thing to have done.
Well, I don't believe it's the reason that the government has stopped us travelling, although I would note that Australia is, as far as I understand it, the only democratically governed country in the world, and one of very few countries of any type in the world, along with China, which is interesting company for us to be keeping in this context, given the current state of relations between us and China, one of very few countries that has actually banned its citizens from leaving as part of its response to COVID. And although I'm in no sense a health expert, I do sometimes wonder how banning Australians from leaving helps keep the virus at bay, provided, of course, you require returning Australians when they return from overseas to quarantine, which, of course, you would have to do. I guess the government would say, well, it reduces the pressure on the quarantine system and allows the government to get away with ignoring the recommendations of experts like Jane Holton as to how more quarantine facilities should be provided. But as I say, other countries with whom we normally compare ourselves haven't thought it necessary to ban their citizens from going overseas as part of the response to COVID. But I'm sure the government is aware that among the corollaries of this particular measure, as well as the more understandable limits on people coming to Australia from overseas, whether as migrants or tourists or students, has been to provide a short-term fillip to the Australian economy in the form of increased spending domestically of money that people would have preferred to spend overseas if they'd been allowed to, and less competition for Australians looking for work from migrants, which makes it easier to get the unemployment rate down. And that's why I term this a form of new protectionism, because after all, the protectionism that Australia practiced from the time of Federation until the early 90s, when it dawned on us how seriously that had been adversely affecting our standards of living. The whole purpose of protection, as it was called, was in effect to force Australians to spend on home-produced goods money they would have preferred to spend on foreign-produced goods. Well, now they were doing that in relation to services instead of goods. And secondly, Secondly, to create jobs, which for Australians, which we are indirectly doing by removing the competition that they face from migrants, in the same way that we pretended to create jobs for motor vehicle manufacturing workers and textile workers and refrigerator maker workers and things like that, by preventing Australians from buying those goods if they were made by foreigners. And like the old style form of protectionism, initially the effects of that appear to be favourable. They boost spending at home, they create jobs. But as we learnt the hard way over a 90-year period, they also reduce the efficiency of your economy, they undermine productivity, and ultimately they result in declining living standards by comparison with countries that choose better and, I would say, more sensible paths of economic development. So you have to hope that the government stated assumption that the borders will remain closed until the middle of next year doesn't turn out to be an underestimate.
Back to unemployment. So look, what if employment does grow at half the pace so far this year? And at what point do you think the Reserve Bank would actually have to do a complete about-face and change not only its rhetoric, but actually start to tighten monetary policy? Would it be when unemployment goes below 4%? Well, or what? What do you think?
It wouldn't be. I don't think the Reserve Bank would start to alter monetary policy simply because the unemployment rate was below 4%. even though they've kind of hinted that that's the sort of unemployment rate they think.
But they've been targeting employment.
Yeah. What they've strictly been targeting is inflation sustainably within the 2 to 3% target range. And they've said that in order to get that, they think the labour market needs to be sufficiently tight to generate wages growth of something in excess of 3% per annum. And they further said they think the unemployment rate that would be required to achieve that is something with a 4 in front of it, although Guy Debelle has said on at least one occasion, maybe even something with a 3 in front of it. But the more important point is that they're on the record as saying that they don't really know what the unemployment rate needs to be in order to generate the sort of wage pressures that are consistent with keeping inflation at between 2 and 3%. They've in effect said they'll know it when we see it. It's a little bit like a famous Supreme Court judge's definition in a US Supreme Court case in 1964, I think it was, of pornography. He said you can't define it, but you know what it is when you see it. And the Reserve Bank is effectively saying we will know that we're at the unemployment rate we need to be when inflation is between 2 and 3%. And it will take a little time, I guess, once we get to whatever the required unemployment rate is, for that to show up in the form of higher inflation. But what I think it does mean for the Reserve Bank's communication strategy, for its guidance to markets, is that they're going to have to choose between upholding the economic criteria they've stipulated, namely a labour market that's sufficiently tight to generate wage inflation sufficiently strong to push inflation between 2 and 3%, which they say they don't know exactly what they will be, or on the other hand, adhering to their repeated stipulation that won't be until 2024 at the earliest. I think they do have a dilemma if we get to the point where the labour market's sufficiently tight to generate the sort of wage inflation that will push price inflation into the 2 to 3% range before 2024 at the earliest. I think it's increasingly likely that we will if the borders remain closed beyond the middle of next year. And I would expect that the Reserve Bank will be seeking to explain how circumstances have changed. Indeed, it may be, and I don't want to overinterpret this, it may be that the governor of the Reserve Bank was laying the groundwork for a shift in its guidance in the speech that Phil Lowe gave in Toowoomba last Thursday, where he didn't use the phrase 2024 at the earliest in signalling when the Reserve Bank might start to think about changes in monetary policy. Maybe we'll get some additional insight into that after the next Reserve Board meeting in July, when, as we know, it's going to be making some very important decisions about its bond purchase programs.
We'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much, Saul.
Thanks, Alan. Pleasure being with you again.